Okay. Oh, my kidding me? Oh, what? All right, all right, all right. Okay, let's get started. So I'm gonna introduce you today. Can we close this door by any chance? Just maybe leave it somewhat open through the trash can, but like not so big, yeah. But okay, feel weird not having my notes. Thank you. All right, so introduction to Genesis, and what I want to do today is go into how I believe the book of Genesis is part of the mother's house, right? And this is unusual because in the book of Genesis, we kind of have the stories of the patriarchs, as it is called. So I want to look into that. We're going to go over our 5 points, right? Mother's house points, and we're going to look how the book of Genesis fits into that so that we can get into the spirit of the book of Genesis and better enter into our texts, right? Genesis 1 to 3. I'm open to whatever. When I say something, if you see something that you want to add, make sure you tell me. This is always welcome, right? Especially if you're familiar with the text of Genesis. If you're like, oh, but Professor, here too, there's an element that I think fits. Feel free to interrupt and let me know. But here's what I have found so far. Okay, so first of all, Book of Genesis is not typically seen as the mother's house book, right? So let me say a little bit why. So, I mean, obviously, right, the obvious reason we have a male God speaking mostly to male characters, right? God is speaking mostly to the patriarchs in the book of Genesis, talking mostly to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, later sort of Joseph, right? So definitely there it doesn't seem very encouraging in terms of mother's house. There's not yet the law, right? We talked about how in the Father's house, the law is the central tenet of it, but not yet the law, but you have this notion of obedience, vertical obedience to God, right? God says, God commands, usually commands for the patriarch to go here or there, or to not go here or there. So there is, however, the beginning of the law, because the verb to go in Hebrew, halach, is what becomes the word for law, halacha. So let me write this down. So you already have the kind of like implicit law, right? So halach, yeah, halach is the verb which means to go. So when God tells Abraham, go, he's using that verb, right? Go out of your country, go out of your nation. He's using the word halach to go. And later when we talk about the law, the word for law is halakha. So it's a kind of a moving, right? Movement inspired by God or commanded by God. So we don't have yet the 10 commandments, or the law is not yet given on Sinai, but we have definitely God giving commands and the people following more or less blindly. So you have this strong verticality going on, certainly in the book of Genesis. You also have the emphasis on national purities. There's elements of that in the book of Genesis. For example, they never get a wife from the Canaanite nations, right? Anytime one of the sons in this patriarchal line, right, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they always find wives from within their own people. They don't like it when they intermarry with the surrounding nations. There's also the famous scene of the rape of Dinah, if you're familiar. So she kind of wanders off into a neighborhood, right, into a neighboring town. This guy there falls in love with her, sleeps with her, wants to marry her, is enamored, and asks for permission from Jacob and his sons, and they say, sure. But first you need to circumcise all the men in your village. And they're like, sure, we'll do it. They do it, right? And then they're sitting there in agony. And then that's the moment they choose to come and destroy, kill them, exterminate them all, right? For having raped their sisters. So there's not much, not much friendly connections, right? The sons of Jacob are not very much interested in integrating or assimilating with the surrounding nations. They're very much criticized by Jacob at that point. Not yet. When Jacob dies, he curses them over this. Right, he's never got over it. So you can see how it is in very, very strong patriarchal text in many ways, but there are also many, many, many mother's house elements in the text that we're going to look at right now. So let's start with the first one, the first element of the mother's house, masculine versus feminine, right? So first of all, what you need to know is that, so we know that Moses wrote the book of Genesis, right? This is attested. The only issue is that chapters 1 to 11 in Genesis have a radically different style than chapters 12 on, right? And they're stories which predate Moses, which predate the story of even Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So these are very ancient stories, which most likely were transmitted from generation to generation and were in the possession of the priestly caste of Israel. And Moses probably borrowed those stories and then wove them into his own writing. So it's not like Moses sat there, just like for the Quran, for example, where and he got this kind of divine revelation. No, those stories pre-existed Moses. He kind of brought them into his writing, and then he's really writing from chapter 12 on, right? So those stories are actually very, very ancient. If you read chapters 1 to 11 in Genesis, you will see connections. I think I mentioned this before, linguistic connections with the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example. Similar stories, similar idiomatic expressions. And so you have connections also, I believe, with the text we read from Inanna, right? So these are texts which are so ancient, they date, I think, around that time, 3000, 2000 BC, right? And these texts, because they're so ancient and because I believe they're coming from Sumer, right? I remember Abraham came from Sumer. They are also going to be have a very strong matriarchal fiber, especially Genesis 1 to 11 has a very strong Sumerian flavor, very strong matriarchal flavor, because I believe they were written, there are texts that are contemporary to the Epic of Gilgamesh or the sacred marriage between Inanna and Dumuzi that we studied in class, right? So for this reason, these particular 11 chapters are going to have a strong matriarchal fiber. And we see this especially, and we're going to study it in the central character of Eve, which we're going to study next week, right? Spend the whole week on Eve. She's very central character, very powerful character. She's been given a bad reputation by the church and the synagogue, but actually, when you actually read the text, she's the center character, right? She is the powerful figure which moves things forward, right? So in that sense, a very strong matriarchal beginning, right? With this powerful woman who kind of opens up human history, right? Later, when you look at the patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, you notice that they're really have very strong spouses. Their wives are very strong characters in the text. They are mentioned by name. They intervene. They meddle with sacred history, right? They are told, God tells Abraham, for example, to listen to the voice of his wife. It's very interesting, right? Abraham is told, your wife is on, she knows the truth about this, that you listen to her, right? Rebecca actually talks to God about her pregnancy, right? So these women are very powerful, and Rebecca actually intervenes at one point. She has received a divine revelation that her youngest son will be the heir to the spiritual inheritance, and she comes and she makes it happen in a way, right? So you have these women that are in a way guiding the course of sacred history. They're intervening. They're in a way channeling things, right? They're part of the yeah, they're part of that history. They're making history in many ways, right? So there's very powerful roles given to these matriarchs, right? Which are not mentioned enough in my view, right? Okay, anything else? Those of you who know the book of Genesis, just on the masculine, feminine, is there anything else you've noticed, if you're familiar with those texts, which point to a strong feminine presence or strong feminine protagonists and so forth? Anything else you want to add to what I just said? Get my water while you think. Oh yeah, extend and then there we go.
I don't think that Eve is necessarily framed as a bad character, but she's most certainly a facilitating character.
Yeah, how so?
Well, her name within itself, right? How does she get, what does her name come from?
Yeah.
Right? She's the mother of all the living.
Exactly.
She doesn't, if you really wanted to frame her in a really bad light, you wouldn't give her that name.
Oh, that's nice. Very nice. Yes. So Eve actually is seen quite positively, right? In the text, and later her role will be kind of distorted. She will be seen as a temptress, the seductress, she'll have the beginning of the fall. But in the text, actually, she is given a very powerful role, right, by Adam, right? There's no mention of her bringing death into the world. On the contrary, right?
Never gets it.
And what?
Adam never gets it.
That's true. Okay, so yeah, that I didn't notice that. See, this is a good observation, guys. Follow the example. Adam never gets a name, she gets a name. What does it say about her, right? More, we can go even further. We will when we study her, but we'll save it for later. But the way they were created is radically different too. The Hebrew verbs are radically different, point to something very interesting, which we'll talk about. Mhm.
Eve was created out of Adam's rib.
Yep.
So she took a part of him with her.
Yes, very true, very true. So he's kind of he's wounded in a way that she isn't, right? So definitely there's this notion, absolutely. Davidov, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. Diegetically, he never gets named. Like, there's no point where, there's no
Adam.
point where
Adam
God,
is man.
Yeah,
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 yeah, but
human.
there is a transition where it goes from just saying the man to just man as an Adam, like a name. So maybe that might be a translation thing, but it's there is a point. It's only after the
Yeah.
bite from the apple that he gets referred to as Adam as opposed to the man.
Oh, interesting. So after the apple, the apple. We don't know if it was an apple. Yeah, after the apple, that's when he's called Adam, right? That's when
No. Not necessarily.
No, because it's called human.
yeah, he's still the same
Human or
generic
man,
name,
kind
right?
of a generic
Yeah.
name.
Yeah,
It-
yeah.
The translation into English maybe more so.
Yeah,
Capitalization and stuff. like that, but
Exactly.
Hebrew isn't like that.
just Adam, from Adama. Yeah. Very good. Adam is simply means earthling. It's from the word Adama, which means earth. So it's earthling, right? Okay. No, not much, but I know enough for the text here. Okay, good. Anything else you want to add about the strong feminine flavor of the Genesis? Anybody else? Okay, let's go to the next one. You guys good? Cleared it up? I would want to see the Hebrew for that too at the end of class. I'm interested to see whether it shifts from Ha'adam to Adam. I'm curious. So I want to see it. After class, show it to me. We're going to the second point. Okay, second point is this. So remember in our 5 points, which we'll talk about over and over again. Second point is vertical versus horizontal, right? Remember the father's house is more vertical. It's more God says and human beings do. In the mother's house, we have more of a horizontal approach, meaning what is happening now is human beings are speaking to each other. And it is within, and God in a way is backstage, right? God is not so much speaking. He is in a way implicit. He is, as Buber would say, like I mentioned before, he is in between people, right? God is kind of, the divine is happening as the conversation is flowing. This is when so God in a way occurs between people, right? There's no more this direct vertical connection. It's a more horizontal one. So the way I found it here, it's interesting. So in the book of Genesis, and this I found really fascinating, God is not positioning himself in a position of authority. I want to really emphasize that. God is much more of a facilitator and instigator of human progress, right? So I'll say that again because I want you to get that one down and then I'll explain. So he's not establishing for himself an authoritarian position like he will later in Exodus when he's on the mountain giving rules, right? Then there's a very strong authority there emanating from that mountain. But in the book of Genesis, God is not in a position of authority. God is more of an instigator, a facilitator of human progress. So let me explain. In other words, God in a way provokes human beings to act and provokes human reactions so that human beings can begin to evolve. The best example is where he put the tree. Anybody remember where he put the tree of good and evil?
In the Garden of Eden.
But where exactly?
That
In the middle. Why would he do that if he's not, take a look at this tree. What do you think? Tree forbidden. What's he doing, right? Why is he, It is, but we can say that. Oh, well, it's still, you're right. The tree is metaphorical, but in the middle, this notion of putting it in your face, right? It's as though God is like, okay, here's the tree. It's right in the middle. I hope you all see it. Now, don't touch it. I mean, who in this class is not going to touch this tree? Do we agree that all of us are going to actually, the tree's in the middle, right in your face, and then God is like, can't have that. What is God doing if not provoking us to trespass. I don't know. I don't see. Do you see it? Do you see what I'm saying? Right? That is the best way to do it. Is to two.
Yes.
He's what? Exactly.
Lots of people.
You got it. You got. He did two things that is the best thing to do if he wants us to eat this tree. He put it in the middle, and then he said you can't have it. These are two incentives, as far as I'm concerned, right? If you want me to not do something, don't tell me it's forbidden, right? I'm gonna want to do it then. So there's a notion of instigating here that I'm seeing, right? There's a few more examples so that you can get it. Here's another good one. We won't study this text, but it's very good. Cain and Abel. Everything's going well. They go, both of them, to offer a sacrifice. And then what does God do to really, really shake things up?
Chooses.
He ignores Cain and focuses on Abel. What is he doing if not provoking Cain? And of course, Cain gets provoked, right? So there's a few more. Here's another great one. Joseph is the kind of the mama's boy, not mama's boy, daddy's boy, right? Joseph is kind of already hated by his brothers, right? Joseph is already the star. He's already the preferred one. Jacob loves Joseph more than all of his brothers. And then what kind of dream does God send Joseph?
The inheritance.
Where everyone is bowing before him. And of course, he tells, if that is not instigation, right? So are you seeing what I'm seeing? That God, in a way, is he's provoking things. He's provocative. He's pushing. He's kind of an instigator, right? And then the human beings walk right in the traps, right? That he said. Yes.
What are you?
Yes, you can do that.
Choice.
You can do that. Yes.
Plenty of people, for instance, he offers Abraham a whole bunch of choices, but Abraham always chooses the right path. So
That's
he's
true.
offering people free will.
Right. Yes.
And then what people do with the free will is a whole nother question, but he's only offering people free will.
And here's the beauty of it. And this, I think you're going to love. Whatever choice they make, and that brings me to my next point, they find their way somehow. So let me, that brings me to the wisdom point. So I'll hold that thought, right? So for now, just, I want you to see a little bit how God, in a way, is kind of, he's like you're saying, Epstein, he's giving people choices, and people are moving left and right, and God, in a way, is following them, right? God is not telling them exactly, you got to do this, you got to do that. God is saying, here are your options. And then he follows them into these options and does something out of it. Let me give you an example let me go to the next point so you can see very clearly. Law versus wisdom. We're still in this notion, vertical command versus horizontal, right? So in the book of Genesis, right, we don't have clear authority. God is, like you're saying, giving people options. Here's a tree, here's that tree, here's this path, here's that path, here is this dream, do what you want. Here is this, I'm going to pick Abel, now what are you going to do, right, and so forth. So there's not really authority, but there's this notion of the view here in the book of Genesis, which I find interesting, is the take that God takes when he's dealing with disobedience or transgression, right? So again, God plays the tree, or God accepts this sacrifice, or God gives this dream, or God tells Abraham, you will have a son, right? And so forth. And then human beings pick way A or way B, right? No matter what path they take, God, in a way, redeems whatever path they take. Let me give you a really cool example of that, of the way that God is following us rather than leading us in the book of Genesis. God is more or less following human beings. Abraham, he tells Abraham, okay, I'm going to give you a son. Abraham's like, cool, great, wonderful. 10 years later, Abraham's like, where's my son? Right? Why don't I have a son yet? And God's like, no, don't worry, be patient, you'll get a son, and so forth. Now, his wife rises up, and what does she say? Anybody remember? After a while, it's like, Abraham, we got to do something about this. What does she do? What? Yeah, exactly. She, not Rahab, Hagar, right? Very good. But yeah, you have the gist of it. She's like, here, Abraham, God is, probably he wants to move through us. Here, take my servant, sleep with her, and so forth. So God had promised Abraham, I will make you great. I will make you the father of a great nation. That was the promise, right? Hagar steps in, has a baby. Does anybody remember what God says right after that? Yes.
Says that your descendants will not come through. He will also be made into a great nation, but my covenant will not be with him. My covenant will be through a child that I will give you.
True. And then he says this, you will be the father of many great nations. He shifts. You look at the text. I don't have it here sadly, but if you look at the text, first he promised him, you will be the father of a great nation. One. Hagar steps in, big mistake, right? Problem. Lots of problems happen. She's kicked out. She comes back, blah, blah, blah. God is like, oh, okay, this happened. All right, well then, let me change it up. You'll be a father of many great nations. Do you see how God is working with Abraham, right? It's as though Abraham is leading and God is following. Do you see what I mean by horizontal? That's what I mean, is that in the book of Genesis, they're working together. It is a genuine partnership where sometimes Abraham follows God and sometimes God follows Abraham, right? Sometimes the human being takes the lead, sometimes the divine takes the lead. They are shifting, they're working like an old married couple, right? Sometimes the woman takes the lead, sometimes the man takes the lead. They are submitting to each other. Sometimes the man follows God, sometimes God follows the man. There's a horizontality there. Are you catching what I'm saying? Right? God, in a way, is not in a position of authority. He's in a position of covenant. Make sure you write this down. This is different. God there is not acting like an authoritarian deity. He's acting like the partner in a covenant, meaning sometimes I follow you, sometimes you follow me, and you do this. Well, no problem. Let's make something out of it and so forth. Are you following me? Do you see what I'm saying? Right. So in that sense, I find it interesting, right? We don't yet have the authoritarian God on Mount Sinai dictating every action from the human beings. Here we have more of a marriage, right? Here, they're kind of moving with each other. And when Abraham does this, God is like, okay, no problem. I can do something with that. All right, you'll be father of several nations. No problem, not a big problem. And so forth and so forth, right? Now it goes even further. And this is still with the notion law and wisdom. It looks to me when I read the book of Genesis that God in many ways is less appalled by our transgressions than the later God in the book of Exodus. Let me explain. I know this sounds very subversive and controversial. I will first explain why. In the book of Genesis, God is more of a creator God. In other words, he's creative. And what is more exciting to an artist? Well, tell me, what does the artist get excited about? When you're an artist and you want to create something, what do you work with best? Do you work with a finished product? I'm going to take a big painting there. Now no. What do you work with as an artist?
Little by little.
Exactly. But what's the basis? It's always the
creative process.
Exactly. You love the process more than the outcome. And you love to work with raw materials. Now, what is the best raw material? What is the best chaos that our transgressions? As soon as we transgress, God is like, ooh, chaos. Let me see now what I can do about this, right? There's an excitement, I think, in God when we start to make wrong turns, because at that moment, ooh, chaos. Now, let me see what I can do with it. The God in the book of Genesis is much cooler about transgressions than the later on gods, because God in the book of Genesis is primordially a creative God. He enjoys chaos. He gets excited by chaos because then, oh, chaos. Now let me see what I can do about this. And you see this over and over again, the way that he restores chaos. Here's a big chaos. Joseph told his dreams to his brothers. His brothers send him off to Egypt. Big chaos. Remember, Joseph's supposed to be the leader of the tribe. That's what Jacob meant for him to be. He's supposed to be the next generation of leaders. He's supposed to carry the spiritual inheritance. Now he's in Egypt a slave. What is going to happen now? What does God do? God is like, ooh, he's in Egypt. What happens? What happens next? It's over. I mean, he's in Egypt. Who's going to lead the tribe? These idiots? These 12 other idiots? Who's going to do it? What's going to happen? What does God do? Yes, you don't remember the story? Yes.
When he creates another leader,
Who's the other leader?
Judah.
Ah, good point. I thought of that. You got me there. You're right. You're right, actually. No, you're right. Judah becomes the leader. But what happens with Joseph's experience? What is it? What does God do about Joseph? And then what is made possible through his leadership, through his rising to the level of Pharaoh? What is made possible through that? Yes?
I mean, several things, but what's made possible is that his family does come back to Egypt, and that Egypt is able to survive a famine, and all the surrounding nations are able to survive a famine that otherwise would have destroyed them.
Exactly. And Joseph himself says, you guys meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That is the creative God. Whatever was meant for evil, God sees that and is like, he gets excited. And he's like, let me take this now and make something good out of it. Because he is the creator God, he my take, and the way I'm seeing God work in Genesis, he doesn't get all offended when the brothers send Joseph to Egypt, right? You don't see God like, oh, what just happened? You know, woe to you, tribes of Israel. No, he says, he's like, okay, you did this. Let's see what I can do. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And he creates a masterpiece. This is one of the biggest lessons in the book of Genesis, is that God is not appalled or worried or disturbed by our transgressions or mistakes or our falls. On the contrary, God sees those as opportunities of creation. That is something that is extremely important to know the next time you make a terrible, fatal mistake, right? This is where you can realize God actually, this is raw material for his creative power, right? This is the view that I'm seeing over and over again at work in the book of Genesis. Somebody makes a terrible transgression and God transforms it for good. Let me give you another moment where I see that God is not impressed by our transgressions. We won't study it, so I'll mention it now. So we're in Genesis 3. The human couple has just sinned. They've eaten the apple. It's over. Death has entered the picture. It's the end of the world. And God comes to visit. Does anybody know what is God's mood when he comes to visit that night?
Forgiving the children, he lets them rest on the day of rest, and after it's over, he kind of leaves them and makes garments for them.
Oh, you see a Sabbath there. Where? I'm curious.
After
the fall, there's a Sabbath?
They sin on Friday.
No, how do you know? Is in the text or is in the tradition?
It's in the tradition.
Okay.
They
No,
sin on
I like
Friday,
that.
they
Yeah.
rest, and then they
Oh,
get thrown out.
that's very interesting. I like that. I like that.
12 hours.
Okay, suspense. They're like sitting the worst Sabbath ever. You know, it's like, what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen? That's nice. I like that. That's very interesting.
They're supposedly supposed to be thrown out immediately.
They have one
He
more
said
day.
you have a day left.
Oh. I like that. That's a good one. Here's what's in the text. In the Hebrew, I don't have my text. Sorry, I didn't bring it. But in the Hebrew, God arrives, and it says literally the verb there is to stroll through the garden. They've just sinned. It's finished. It's over. And God arrives strolling through the garden. Look up the verb and you will see that's what it is. So this is really interesting, right? God arrives, very cool, very chill, very relaxed. They've just destroyed everything, but he's not disturbed by it. And in fact, this for him is the beginning of history. It's the beginning now of his creative opportunities, right? So are you seeing, let's have a little discussion about this notion, because I see some of you are still perplexed. What do you think about this view of God that God has about our transgression? This is the mother's house view, right? Remember, the father's house view is a little different. The father's house is like, you messed up, rah, take this, take that, right? Consequences, judgments, and so forth, right? In the mother's house, it's a little more like, oh, you sinned, all right, let me see what I can do with this. Let's see what we can do with this, right? Imagine, for example, a child comes, is baking something, messes it up. Have you ever had this where you mess up a dish and your mom kind of fixes it? Yeah, okay, one person. Not in y'all don't step in the kitchen.
Fail.
You just fail, that's it. Your mom doesn't come and like arranges
It's
it.
just a sign to
This is over. Okay, my mom used to do that. I would mess something up. She'd be like, oh, just add this, it's gonna be okay. You know what? This is how God is, this is what God does, right? He sees the chaos we've created. And more than that, he doesn't just, patch it up. He gets excited. I mean, I know I'm saying something really revolutionary, but I'm seeing this and that. He gets excited. He's like, ooh, now we have something to work with. Now let me see what I can do with this. And then he creates a masterpiece. That's what I want you to write down and remember, right? God sees the chaos we just created. That's number one. Through our transgressions or mistakes or wrong turns, right? And he gets excited. Why? Because he's creative. Let me give you a great example of that. How many of you know women who seem to always love to date losers? Anybody? You see what I'm saying? These women, high achieving women, dating losers. Why do you think they do that? Let's point. You think what?
I think they get some.
And why? Why? They do.
Yeah.
Why? Why
I have no
do
idea.
why do these high achieving women love to date losers? Yes, tell me.
because they think they're gonna change the person.
They get excited because they're creative. Ooh, unfinished product. Ooh, let me see what I can do with this, right? So they get it. This is exactly God. God is that high achieving woman dating us humanity and loving it, every bit of it. He's like, ooh, chaos everywhere. Wow, let me see what I can do with this. This is what I'm seeing, right? Over and over again. I'm kind of dramatizing it right now, but this is what I'm seeing in every story. Chaos and transformation into something even better. That is the signs of somebody deeply creative, right? God is creator in the book of Genesis. Later, he becomes judge. Right now, he's creator, right? Mother's house. Okay, let's discuss that. Epstein, you look doubtful. Tell me. Speak.
I don't agree with that statement. At its very principle, because God in Genesis, first of all, dealing with a completely different crowd.
Yes?
His first people are Adam and Eve, right? They get thrown out. So
Yep.
he goes, okay, again. And then he has Cain and Abel, and then he mocks Cain,
Yep.
when he kills his brother.
Yep.
He doesn't fix him, he just mocks him.
He does provoke him over and
He
over again.
says, okay, 7 generations, and we'll start over again with the third brother.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have Noah, and God says, you know what, I'm giving up on these people. Let's wipe them out, start all over. Again." He's not fixing anybody.
He's not, he's
hitting
not.
The reset button, but it's not, and after Noah comes Abraham, and
Yep.
goes with Abraham a little bit, but after that, the people who are chastising the sinners are other people.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of where you mentioned in the rape of Dinah,
Yeah.
right? Who chastises the brothers?
Right.
Jacob does. Their own father comes down and yells at them. So they don't need to be chastised by God.
Right,
They're being
right.
chastised by their father, which is, the way we look at things, the way it should be. In later editions in Exodus and the later stories, he's not speaking to individuals.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Speaking to a nation, and he's forming a nation. It's really playing with a different deck of
Yep,
cards
that's true.
than a couple of individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when it gets to the nation, it becomes much more terrifying, right? God becomes much more vertical, much more, perhaps he needs to have a stronger hold on these crazy people, right? But when he's dealing with individuals, you can see that there's a leniency. Cain murders his brother, and God is still working with him, right? Not yet punishing him, just banishing him, right? Working with him. And you're right. There are
Kind of just says, okay, you're done. Bye. He doesn't work with him.
Yes, that can be sadly we won't study the text, but I believe he does, because to send him into exile is actually is more of a redemptive than a punitive stance. And I can't go into that, and we can after class if you want, but there's elements here where he's still working with him, right? Nevertheless, even though he already killed his brother, he continues to run after him, right? But just to give you a few examples of this creative grace, right? We can call it grace. You have the Hagar story, right? Where God in a way works with it, right? He's like, okay, and gives Hagar a great nation, 12 tribes, just like Abraham, right? Hagar in a way becomes parallel to Abraham. So he's working with the situation. You have the story of Joseph where everything is transformed into good. Help me find examples in the book of Genesis where there's chaos and good comes out of it. That's the idea, right? Help me find other examples. Jacob just swindled his brother, right? For the birthright, goes into exile. What's the first thing that happens when he arrives at his destination? Finds the love of his life. I mean, come on now. What kind of punishment is that, right? And then of course, then it gets, you're right, then it gets a little darker. Things get a little darker. Yeah.
His brother comes after him.
And
for the
somehow
rest of time.
that is true. It's
He creates a like generational grudge match.
not such a great example. You're right.
There's a momentarily a thing of forgiveness, and there's some reconciliation there.
Yeah, with the Esau.
Temporary at best.
It's powerful though. It's a powerful
Temporary,
moment.
but the temporary truce.
You gotta give it.
It's not logically impossible for there to be a truce, so that hope always stays because of that one.
Right.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, so we have some stories, right, where things are transformed, where there is chaos and somehow that chaos is turned into something even better, right? Yes.
I also kind of disagree with the idea that God takes pleasure in chaos or sin as support, because I feel like that might be a little bit of a, what's the word? Sadist. Thank you, perfect word. Sadist. If you look at it, I think God takes pleasure in choice, because from choice comes dignity. He takes pleasure in us exercising our free will, but he would have taken pleasure in that had we chosen not to sin, as well as if we had chosen.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I'm being a little rhetorical, hyperbolic, right? For the sake of provocation. What I mean is that God is not appalled, or God is not disturbed by our transgressions. And I'm being very literal, right? God in a way sees our transgressions as opportunities for creative action.
So you mean disturbed in a sense that he would give up, but disturbed like beyond repair.
Like he's not taken by surprise, like, oh damn, well now we have to go to plan B. Oh, he ruined everything. You know, that's what I mean. We get the sense sometimes that we make such mistakes that we ruin everything. For God, it's not the case. It's like, oh, all right, let's see what I can do with this. It's a creative opportunity. I really see that, right? In the stories. I see maybe God is not, dancing and cheering like when we make a terrible mistake, right? But I think that God, in a way, based on those stories, is not disappointed or he's not shocked and appalled, right? He is, in a way, he's like, oh, okay, this happened now. Let's see what I can do with it and he works with us. You see, he works with our transgressions. There's an element of poiesis in the Greek of creative shaping of our mistakes.
That's always the right response to transgression, but it doesn't, I don't think, function as a justification for that.
No, not at all. Right. And I mean, Jacob, there was a lot of suffering. Obviously, he never saw his mother again. He ended up with 2 wives. He got swindled just like he swindled. I mean, there's elements of suffering, but the creative power of God is in a way so powerful that what was meant, like Joseph said, what was meant for evil ends up being meant for good. That, I think, is one of the theological lessons of the book of Genesis, which we often forget because we are taught in the Father's house where transgression matters, where it's a serious issue. And I'm not downplaying that, right? Remember, I want to hear the mother's house and the Father's house together. So it's important to see how transgression can hurt people, can be abusive, can be problematic, but at the same time, you have the tremendous creative power of God, which can reverse everything. That's what I'm seeing. Does that make a little more sense? Epstein and Davidov? Davidov is okay. Epstein is still thinking. Okay, let's move on to the next point. Separation versus integration. Okay, now here I see, so there's definitely, of course, a lot of, preserving the purity of the race going on in Jacob's family. But at the same time, these are all stories of exile, right? Meaning Abraham is constantly called outside of his own land and country into strangeness, into new land, into foreign spaces, right? And you have this, all of the Hebrews, even when they go to Egypt, are strangers in a strange land. So you have this notion, this idea that the spiritual path is meant to take you outside of yourself, inside a strange place. You're not meant, as a spiritual person, you're not meant to be in a comfortable place. You're not meant to be comfortable, right? The true spiritual path will always take you out of your Father's house, of your where you were raised, what you learned, how you were taught. The spiritual path always takes us beyond everything that we were taught to be. Does that make sense? So you're taught to be, so you're raised by a church, let's say, or by a synagogue, or by a certain way of thinking, or by your parents. Whatever they taught you, God is going to call you out of it. That's what we're seeing, right? You have to be prepared always to transcend whatever you have been up until now. The spiritual path is always structured as self-transcendence, right? And so Abraham has to leave behind his own family, and then Jacob has to leave, and then Joseph has to leave, and they all leave and go into more and more uncomfortable foreign spaces, because that is where God is genuinely encountered, right? So there's definitely this notion of being a stranger, which later on God will say, because you were strangers, now you will love the stranger, right? So he's training them. In a way, the Hebrew psyche is in a way structured as an essential connection with the outside, right? The Hebrew subject is never meant to be just, I am this. Hebrew subject is relational, always connected to the outside world. There's always an element of connection to the stranger. So here in the book of Genesis, they're taught to be strangers, so that later in the book of Exodus, they can become welcoming to strangers, right? The ethos of the 5 books of Moses, and it's true, we have a lot of genocide and massacres and wars in the 5 books of Moses, but one of the key principles is the love of the stranger, right? That is what is supposed to shape the Hebrew psyche, is the love of the stranger. I am me in as much as I am able to welcome you identity is connected to otherness, right? I am fully myself in connection with you, the outsider, the other, right? And you have this over and over again, exiles, right? Starting with Adam and Eve, they're exiled. Cain is exiled. Then later you have the Tower of Babel, they're exiled, right? God is constantly pushing us outside of our comfort zone because he cannot be found in our comfort zone. He can only be found in a space that is uncomfortable, right? Does that make sense? Are you seeing that? Any comments on that? What do you want to, yes, Davida.
So I agree with your distinction between like this is more of a feminine way of taking it than a masculine. But instead of saying it's focused on God's relationship to us as father versus mother, because I would feel like both of them would want us to stay at home and be comfortable at home. I'd say this is more of a relationship between how we deal with him as either a son or a daughter. Because a son is like commanded to, you carry on the family legacy. You might not stay at home, but you're going to carry on the family name. And so these are the laws by which, these are traditions by which you uphold that. But the daughter is given a way to say, married off to a different family. You can find your own path. You can extend something else. And so you have to deal with strangers versus.
You got it, right? Whereas the father's house is much more, let's stay away from strangers and build our identity and our, right? So you have, and both are necessary. Again, I want to emphasize, both are, we have to learn to live in both spaces, right? It is important to maintain one's identity and to be strongly anchored in who one is and what one has received. But at the same time, we have to be capable of openness to progress. We have to be capable of openness to the other. In a way, God is, there's these two movements, right? Anchor yourself, ground yourself, and move, right? It sounds like opposites, but this is the Hebrew mindset is constantly juggling opposites, right? That is the way the Hebrew thinks. This and this, both opposites. And we move like this, right? So that's the one element which I'm seeing about this, openness to the other that we saw in general in the mother's house. They love to bring in strangers, right? Bring them on. Let's like, yeah, come on, Egyptians, Canaanites, right? Join us at the table, right? And here we have this notion now God is pushing them out of their comfort zone into these strange worlds, right? For a reason, so that they might become sensitive, open, non-allergic to the other, right? So that's a very mother's house thing, absolutely, right? Epstein, you want to add something? You're good. Okay. Very good. Okay, great. All right.
Like you're supposed to invite strangers to your table on Shabbat.
Yeah.
Like most of us would say, I'm gonna have somebody I don't know sit down and eat with my family. I don't know how comfortable that is,
Yeah.
I'll do it because, I should do that and it's a nice thing to do. But it could be a little awkward.
Yeah, for sure.
So you have to, it can be because you don't know the person, you don't know how they react.
Oh, no,
whatever.
I'm very used to it.
I know you do, but if you think back when you were a kid, really small.
No, he
you
was
never
cool with it.
bother you. I would say, who is that person? Who's that kid?
Epstein was fine.
You're good. You're the good kid. You're not the one who's like, I don't know, I want to sit next to this person. They're a little different or whatever.
Did you guys, did you see the movie Uzbek, it's a,
Ushpatin?
yes.
Ushpatin,
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that the movie where it's Sukkot and
During the Sukkot. right?
yeah, it's Sukkot. So it's a great movie. Can you spell it for me? I'll put it on the board. Say it at least.
Ushpatin.
Ushpitin with M.
Ushpatin.
Ushpitin.
It's in Hebrew with,
It's an Israeli movie, very cute. It's about this couple who want to have a child, and they know that to have a child, or I don't know, I think they feel inspired. Well, they want to have a child, period, and they're trying to be on their best behavior. Ushpitin. Oh, you know this? Okay. Ushpizim? Oh, you looked it up. Thank you.
With an N.
Ushpizim.
C-N,
Like this?
C-I-N.
Yeah.
Ushpizim. There we go. Okay, all of you, please watch this movie. It's very cute. So anyways, they want to have a kid and they're trying to be on their best behavior. And it's the festival of Sukkot, which is, you're supposed to, at that festival, invite strangers to your table. And it happens, the strangers come to them. There's an old friend who's just came out of jail, and he's with another drunken friend of his. And, they're very religious Jews. So they're like already, oh God, right? And these guys just basically, they crash the party. And they're making them look bad in the neighborhood. They're smoking, they're cursing, they're drinking, they're yelling. And they're just so appalled that they kick them out. And at that moment, what they realize, oh, damn, we had an opportunity to welcome the stranger and be blessed. And so they're all like, ah, and then they come back. So it's like the story of them, dealing with these horrible, crazy people and knowing deep down in them, in their heart, that to welcome them is to attract divine blessing, right? Because you welcome the stranger means you welcome God himself. So they're struggling with this in the movie, and it's a very funny movie about, this law in Jewish tradition that you want to always invite the stranger to your table, which is coming right from these moments here that I'm talking about. Okay, good. Last point, doing versus receiving. Okay, so here we enter what I call the contrast between garden theology and temple theology, right? And this is where we have the most strong distinction between the Hebraic religion and the Sumerian religion, right? Sumerian religion is a religion of temples. They're the ones who built the first, we call it ziggurats, right? You're all familiar with this. These are kind of ancient pyramids. Have you seen this structure before? Which you find all over the world, right? This is a ziggurat. So they're the people, right, they're temple people, right? And remember, the gods in Sumer, why did they create human beings? Remind me, what was the goal?
What's that?
Yes, for food, right? They wanted food. They wanted people to work for them and bring them food, right? In these temples. So these temples are built for the gods, and the people are created, right? Human beings are created so that they can cultivate grain in order to create bread and beer to serve the gods food, right? In contrast, you have in Genesis 1 a garden. And what is God doing in this garden? Remind me.
Feeding man.
He's the one feeding, right? There's a reversal. Instead of him creating human beings to be fed, he creates human beings and immediately offers them food, right? One of the key words in the story of Genesis 1, is natan, which means to give. Okay, that's a key word. God is giving food rather than wanting food, right? From the from the human beings. So you have a flip, right? There is a reversal. The garden is the reversal of the temple or of the ziggurat, right? The garden is where God comes down and feeds the human beings. The ziggurat is where human beings go up and feed God, right? The movement is radically different. It's the movement of human beings going up to offer the food in the ziggurat, and the garden is where God is coming down to, right, feed his newly created human beings, right? So there's a radical different theology here. What does this teach us about the spiritual path? This two contrasts between the temple and the garden. What does a spiritual path look like when you're in a garden theology and when you're in a ziggurat theology, temple theology? What is the main difference? How are you going to live your spiritual path? Let's reflect on that a little bit. What does it look like to be a garden believer versus a temple believer? I guess I'll put it this way, existentially, in your daily life. What does it look like to be a temple believer in your daily life? What does it look like to be a garden believer? Yes.
If you're a temple believer, I would say that you think you're worshiping things that are apathetic to you or possibly even hostile to you, and you're just trying to appease these forces in order to, what you might call it, survive. Or I would even argue that some forms of modern day atheism could be a temple believer, in that you view kind of, well, you're not worshiping anything, but you view like the world as this thing that's indifferent to your plight. So you're just doing your best through science and what have you, practical methods to keep surviving
Got it.
and appease the forces around you. And then
Excellent.
if you're a garden believer, you think that you are worshiping something, but through your actions, you are doing what is best for either you as an individual or the world as this community within the garden.
Now, the way you explain it sounds almost the same. I can't tell the difference. Can you specify?
One is just I'm trying to survive, and the other one is I'm trying to achieve a harmony that's going to benefit either me or the people around me.
Careful, it sounds very similar.
It is very similar. I think both the people are, in both cases, you're trying to live, you're trying to survive, except one of them, the first one views it as combat, and the second one views it as trying to achieve some sort of order or harmony.
That's not combat?
It's combat against chaos, but the chaos is not seen as something it's a blemish of the world as opposed to something fundamental about how the world runs.
Okay, you're almost there, but you're not there because it's still helping. Go ahead.
Okay, to me, like the temple is, you're making the offering. You're living a life of, it's offering. But the garden is being receptive and receiving, and when you receive, then you can absorb that and grow from that.
Okay, now you're on the right track. Would you like to, do you hear what does this help you nuance what you were saying?
You're
Repeat for him, he was.
You're receiving from God, you're receiving, and what you receive enables you then to absorb what you receive and grow from what you received. And in the temple, you're just making an offering, it's just ritualistic offering, but you're not receiving anything in return for that.
Are you,
It's not helping your spiritual growth in any way.
are you able to nuance what you were saying based on what you were, say it again, go ahead. Let's see what you come up
I mean,
with.
I hope that don't people who have temple religions though feel like that they're appeasing the gods in some way? And be like,
That you were right, you're good, but the other one sounds this kind of, I need a stronger distinction. You're right on the temple, you're right on there, but then when you describe the garden, it sounds too close to the temple. So I'm trying to figure out, you want more time to?
you're,
You think
you're,
some more.
you're
Who wants to
receiving
help him?
something.
Who is able to help him and see what he's trying to say? Girls, I don't hear you enough. It's the mother's house, only the guys are talking. What's happening? Anybody want to help Davidov? Yes.
Guess with the temple, you're not guaranteed anything, but with the garden, you get out of it as much as you put in.
Okay, you're very close. Let me elaborate a little. I give you some stuff to write as based on what you guys said, and then we'll continue. So yes, I like what you're saying. In the temple, it's not guaranteed, right? There's an element of anxiety. You're striving. You don't know these gods, what they're going to do next, right? You live in a state of, we call it in philosophy, the state of nature, the state that Hobbes describes. I don't know if you're familiar with the Leviathan, right, by Hobbes, where human beings, right, are depicted like in a lawless world, anything is possible. We could die at any minute. You know, anybody could come and stab us in the back, you know, at any moment. This is the state of nature. And so these temples are built, you know, as, please, you know, like, hopefully I give the right offering so I don't get such bad luck, right? But it's very insecure. There's an anxiety there. Garden is abundance. There is no lack in the garden, right? So what does it mean to live? Of course, we don't live in the garden, right? But what does it mean to live with a garden mentality? Because that's what the mother's house is trying to teach us, right? We live in the world. The world is crazy and chaotic, but we are creatures of the garden. What does it mean to live with a garden mentality in this crazy world? What does it look like? You're there. Like, you want to respond? Or you want more time? Okay. What does it look like to live with a garden mentality in the world we live in? Remember, garden, like you said, pure abundance. There's always some fruit hanging down from some tree, right? You're not going to run out of food in the garden, right? So the invitation of the mother's house is to remind us we are from the garden. We are people of the garden. What does it mean to live in this world with a garden mentality? You want to?
Well, you have security. And
Weirdly.
you have, you know, I'd say greatly less anxiety because there's something there that will be for you and that you can find and that you can nurture. And I will nurture you in return as well.
Okay, there's this notion that there is abundance. I can rest. It's gonna come my way in time. When, right? When is the right time? When, right? You are in a way in a state of rest, right? You're in a way not anxious or trying to make it happen or striving. That's the temple mentality, right? You're going up the stairs, right, of the ziggurat, becoming, you know, totally dehydrated. And then what's the word when your like your heart is beating and you can't breathe? Is there a word for that in English? Yeah, you're hyperventilating, whatever. You're like choking and trying to reach. And garden mentality is you're restful, you're at peace, you're in faith. This is what faith means. Faith is one of the most essential teachings of the mother's house. What is faith? Faith is rest. You're able to rest in the assurance that there will be abundance, that there will be safety, that there will be an outcome, or the door will open, right? Or whatever it is that we're struggling with. And this is the teaching of the mother's house. It's insane, right? Because we don't live in the garden. Look at Queens and New York, right? We don't live in the garden. But the teaching is to remind us, right? That we are creatures of the garden. We come from the garden. We own the garden, in fact, right? And to maintain that garden mentality is to live in a state of, I'm restful. I know it. I am in a state of abundance, right? I believe that I will be provided for. I'm in a state of receptivity, not striving, right? Yes, David.
I
Now
potentially
you-
disagree.
Oh, go ahead. Okay.
But I think even in the garden, we're living in a state of harmony, where it's not, it is still, I think, very similar to the temple thing in which you're doing something, but you're doing something because, to reach that sort of harmony, there's a trust in.
That's it. Now you're clearer. Right. The garden, by the way, the garden this is not the tropics, okay, where you're sitting and a banana falls on your lap. No, right? This is the garden where you got to cultivate, right? There's an element of work in the garden. There, now we're reaching you, David. It's not like one is you're sitting there watching TV and you're hoping, the opportunity will, the lottery, right? You'll win the lottery or whatever, right? No, garden is still work. But it's work which will yield fruit. Whereas the temple, you're offering the sacrifice. You don't know what the God is going to decide to do, right? So both are work, but the work is in a different spirit. The garden, you work day to day, you do your thing. And by the way, what guarantees the growth of your crop in the garden? Is it you blowing on the crop? Grow, grow. Who's making, how does the crop grow? Is it you?
Soil, right?
Exactly. It's not just on you. This is the most beautiful thing about gardening, right? Which I think if we have the mentality, it becomes very powerful. Gardening, I have my part, but then it's not up to me. That's gardening. I did my part. I tended the earth. I tried to water, but ultimately the growth depends on the outside of me. If there is sun, if there's rain, if there's no frost, this is outside of my power. The garden mentality is the mentality that I do my part and God does the rest. And I can rest assured, once I've done my part, it's not in my hands, it's not my problem. Do you see what I'm saying? That's another way I used to live by that mantra, right? It's actually a bumper sticker. Do your best and God will do the rest. Right? I love that. I actually love that bumper sticker. Right? Do your best. It's a great. It has a great sound to it. Right? Do your best. This is the garden mentality. You do your best. You do your part, but the result is not up to you. So you can really relax. In the temple, the result is up to you. You better offer the right sacrifice, or you're screwed. Right? So you have to really be careful in the temple. The result rests on your shoulders. Whereas in the garden, I do my part and the result is up to God. And I can rest in the fact that this is not up to me. I can relax, right? Yes.
Kind of the whole Bible. Like the Sermon on the Mount, basically, it's like Christ calling the people to get the father house mentality into the mother house.
Can you elaborate? I'm interested.
Because like he's saying, like, do not worry.
Yes, that one.
Yeah.
Matthew 6.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I like it. Thank you. So guys, Matthew 6, right? First gospel, chapter 6. You have this beautiful teaching by Jesus where he says, it's very, very nice, very mother's house teaching. Do not worry about what you will eat, what you will wear, right? And basically he's saying, seek first the kingdom and all these things will be given unto you. So we have to work. We have to seek the kingdom. We have to work for God, do our part. But then as we enter this kingdom mentality, we're not working for ourselves, we're working for God. Everything else we longed for it's exactly this idea, right? So Jesus in a way is really, and we're going to talk about Jesus when we do John, pure mother's house, like from A to Z, right? We're going to talk about that. Anybody else want to add anything about this garden versus temple, right? This is a very powerful lesson, theological lesson, just depending if you're a temple theologian or a garden theologian, right? Anybody else want to add anything? Good. All right, so now you get the idea. I hope you get a good, you're in the spirit, right, of the book of Genesis. You're seeing how, yes, on the one hand, there are father's house elements, but there are also a lot coming from the matriarchal tradition. Now, when we study Genesis 1, so next time, what I want you to do is we're going to study the creation of woman and man. There it's together. We're going to look at Genesis 1 and 2. So for Tuesday, I want you to read Genesis 1 and 2. And again, be attentive to the details, right? The biblical text is very succinct. If it's saying something that's out of the ordinary, that sticks out of the narrative, like, oh, why is he saying, adding this detail? Boom, you need to pay attention to that. The author is making a huge point, right? So for example, they noticed, I love that. That was one good example. Adam doesn't receive a name, Eve receives a name. Oh, why? Right? These are the type of questions I want to see. You're reading the text and you're paying attention to the details that stick out, that break a little bit the narrative flow, right? And you're like, why is the author adding this detail? There's a reason. Now we can investigate. So focus on that and begin to think about where on Thursday we'll be reading chapter 3. And this is the big text that we've been preparing for, right? This is where the fall and the curse of God and the way this text has been misunderstood. And I want to have like 2 hours for this text. And are you guys free after this? Like, how's your schedule? Are you? No?
Sometime.
How much time? Good, that's good. What about you? She's like, oh God. Do you have time after this class? Oh, beautiful. Perfect. Okay. Oh, and we might go over, okay? Because such difficult text. I can't do it in 1 hour. I want to go over. So we're probably going to go over.
Speak as to why there are two versions of the creations.
Yes, we can write it in your, I'm gonna look, if you put it in your reading assignment, I'll bring it up. Yes, we can talk about why there's two. Yeah, there's good reason for that. Absolutely. Good. These are such great texts. I'm so excited. Okay. So please focus on Genesis 1 and 2. And for now, we will call it a day.
Class of the 22nd, because it's not listed on the syllabus.
Mondays.
Oh,
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. It's Monday's schedule, so we don't have class. No, I realized Monday was a holiday. Yeah. I forgot about that. They